In this video, we will be exploring some of the darkest, most crazy unsolved mysteries that range from missing people, unsolved murders, unsolved serial killers, a bank heist that involves an insane escape mechanism, and much, much more. As always, grab a drink. My choice today is green tea with watermelon, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. And as always, guys, if you haven't checked out the official merch for this channel yet, we have some very cool mugs down in the description below. All original designs, official Connor's Curiosity merch. We have hats, all sorts of colors and designs. We also have jumpers with cool designs back and front, and yeah, it all supports the channel. I think there are only a few more orders left that will get a personalized handwritten letter from me, so if you're quick, you still might get one on your order. But yeah, thank you for supporting the channel. You guys keep all of the lights on, you keep all of my mugs full of liquid. Well, not all of them, just one at a time, I guess. But yeah, link in the description for some very cool merch. And now let's get into the first entry for this video. Signora Manora is honestly a very strange one, but this was just some woman known in some circles as Italy's luminous woman, who was a patient who was suffering from asthma for several weeks, and then apparently suddenly started to glow, started to emit this glow blue from her breast. Yeah, it was apparently like this light or electrical flash that would like kind of shoot out or explode from her bazonkas and then just fade away. Like, this was a short-term occurrence, a very strange thing which a few people saw, a few people, witnessed and attested to, and that was the luminous woman of Italy. Quite a story. The Turkish Sheep suicide. And you can imagine what that word is, as YouTube doesn't allow me to, say it, but it's one of the only words that I block out, so you can use your imagination. But this entry also was a bit of a strange one. This happened in a region near Guelph in Turkey in 2005, when all of a sudden a single sheep just decided to jump off this cliff, and this sheep obviously just fell to its death. But following this initial jump, many of the sheep behind it, in, classic sheep or herd mentality, started to just follow the sheep and also jumped off this cliff. Now, this led to a crazy little event where over 1,500 sheep ended up jumping off this cliff, with, strangely, only the first 400 roughly that ended up dying. They jumped, they fell to their death, and then the roughly 1,100 that jumped afterwards weren't jumping down onto rock, but they were jumping down onto the 400 super fluffy, thick, cushiony sheep down below. And so because of this, the 1,100 that followed the first 400 ended up just surviving. They never found out what caused the initial sheep to jump, or what, technically caused the following sheep to jump, although it's probably just some form of herd mentality. But yeah, this entire event cost the local farmers and, sheep herders an estimated $60,000 to $100,000 worth of damages, and cost the lives of over 400 innocent fluffy sheep. Alfred Beilhartz was the case of a 4-year-old boy who was one of the 11 children in the Beilhartz family. And basically the whole family was out camping. They were hiking deep in the Rocky Mountain National Park in the summer of 1938. And everything was going normal. Everything was, as you would expect, and at around 8 a.m. on July the 2nd, the family was out hiking along next to a trail next to a creek, and being, a 4-year-old, little Alfred was a relatively slow hiker compared to the rest of his family, which is, I should imagine, to be expected. But during their hike, Alfred slowly started to drift towards the back. Maybe he was with some of his siblings and then they ran ahead and did something. And so eventually the parents who were up ahead on this trail, trying to look after, all of these kids, they suddenly realized, we haven't seen Alfred in a while. So they immediately stopped, they kind of looked around, they figured out that he was probably at the back of the trail, and so they stopped the rest of the family, they went all the way back along the way that they just come, and they shouted out for Alfred. They tried to look around for him in case he had fallen or stopped or something, but he had seemingly just vanished. There was no sign of him, there was no evidence about where he might have gone, you know, like a broken trail through the leaves or bushes, or one of his socks laying around, or his cap or something. And so pretty quickly they notified the park rangers, who then themselves did an initial search, and after not being able to find him, they brought in more people and a massive search was started. They initially thought that he might have, you know, drifted off and fallen into the nearby river, and so they ended up damming the river, you know, further down, and damming in terms of like blocking it off, not in terms of, you know, cussing it out or something. But even though they dammed it, this resulted in no evidence being collected. You know, no Alfred's clothes or clues or anything like that was caught by the dam. So they thought that he might have maybe taken a different route, gotten lost in the woods, and then maybe, you know, fallen off a cliff, or fallen into somewhere he couldn't get out of, or fallen into a lake or something, or, you know, maybe he was attacked by a wild animal. And these were all relatively good theories, I would say. They ended up bringing in bloodhounds who did pick up Alfred's scent, and they did track it along the trail, but only around 500 feet before it went uphill and the dogs could no longer track it. There were no footprints found past that point, and as I said, Alfred was sadly never seen again. There was no body, no clues, no clothes, no even remains if he had been, you know, attacked by an animal or something. And one of the only pieces of evidence that was found was an old bandage in a nearby abandoned cabin that was kind of similar to one that Alfred had on at the time, but the forensics for it were inconclusive. It might have been just, you know, an old bandage. Lots of people do wear bandages when they're out hiking, and that was more or less it. Now, as I said, he wasn't ever seen after that day, but there were a few potential sightings of him, but none were really confirmed or proven. One was by a couple who said that they saw a boy matching Alfred's description being led by an unknown person around 6 miles away from where he disappeared. So that's very suspicious, but this sighting was never really confirmed. The man that they saw was never identified or, you know, found or stopped or interviewed or anything. There was another apparent sighting in Nebraska where these people saw a child matching, again, Alfred's description, walking with an unknown man. But again, these were just kind of vague sightings of a boy that may or may not have looked like Alfred. And so a lot of these were either never followed up on, or if they were found to be, you know, kind of inconclusive. His father, on the other hand, was absolutely convinced that Alfred was stolen, and he said that someone must have stalked them, you know, stalked the family, waited for the perfect moment, and then when Alfred was at the back of the pack, then he, you know, swooped in, picked Alfred up, maybe told him he was going to bring him back to his family or something, and just walked the other way. But again, sadly, whatever did happen to him on that day, we probably, as it was, you know, coming up to almost 100 years ago, never really find out. Yuki Onishi was a somewhat similar case to the one we just covered, and this was the case of a 5-year-old girl in Japan who went missing in 2005 in the middle of a forest with loads of people around during a bamboo shoot digging event. Just a quick reminder, I am trying to hit 75,000 subscribers by the end of this year. Anyone who subscribes will receive a drumstick, a very blurry drumstick. My god, look at that drumstick. But yeah, 1 drumstick for 1 subscribe. Pretty decent deal, I would say. And also hit the like button and enjoy the rest of the video. And so this was on a national holiday in Japan known as Greenery Day, which is, I think, a really cool national holiday in which people basically chill out, relax, and appreciate greenery or nature. So some people use it as just a normal holiday, you know, they take time off work, spend time with their family, etc. But a lot of people use it to appreciate or connect with nature. And so they spend time in parks, in gardens, or in forests or woods. And It's a very cool concept, I think. We should bring it to the West in some form or another. But it was on this particular day in May of 2005 that Yuki Onishi and her mother and her sister were in the Goshi-Kidai forest in the prefecture of Kanagawa. And there were at the time around sort of 50 or 60 people gathered for this event in the forest. And at around 1 p.m, everyone would kind of run off to search the forest to find these newly sprouted bamboo shoots. And think of it kind of like an Easter egg hunt or something, you know, but instead of eggs, they're hunting bamboo. And so after around half an hour of searching, Yuki found her first bamboo shoot. She was super excited about this cool little find. She went back, she showed her mother, and then she goes off in search of more bamboo. Then, almost 30 minutes later, her mother realized that she hasn't seen Yuki in a while, and when she asked around, she realized that nobody else had seen her either. So the group there did kind of a quick initial search of the area. They looked up and down the trail, they shouted her name, but when she still didn't show up after all of this, they called the police and a larger search was started. And initially the police came in, they conducted a search, they couldn't find anything, and so they brought in more firepower. They brought in sniffer dogs, and these dogs actually did manage to find Yuki's scent, and they sniffed it as dogs do. They followed the scent, and then just randomly in the middle of the forest, the scent just vanished, which is very strange. But they continued searching for the better part of like 6 or 7 more hours. Absolutely nothing turned up. You know, no Yuki, no clothes, no evidence, no trail, etc. And initially they thought that she might have wandered off somewhere, fallen into a deep pond, and so they searched a few nearby ponds, even ended up draining some of them, but they found absolutely nothing. And the only clue, if you could really even call it that, was the sighting of a man who at the time walked kind of through the event carrying a very large backpack, which some people noted was large enough to carry, you know, perhaps a 5-year-old girl. This man was never found, never identified. Nobody there knew him or recognized him, and he seemed to be just, you know, a man walking through the forest on Greenery Day. It wasn't too suspicious at the time, but it is always a possibility that he was the one who took Yuki. You know, and some people have pointed out that because the trail stopped just out of nowhere in the middle of the forest, it perhaps could have gone down like, you know, she was in the forest on her own searching for bamboo. This man saw her on her own. He maybe knocked her over the head, subdued her in some way, put her into his backpack. And then because she was in the backpack, she wasn't directly on the ground. Perhaps the scent was, you know, maybe weaker or something. And then he escaped just in plain sight, in plain daylight, through the rest of the crowd, with them being none the wiser. And as I said, none of that was really ever proven, although I think, in my opinion, it is somewhat logical. You know, the other options are her obviously wandering off somewhere, in which case why did her trail just stop in the middle of nowhere? Or her getting picked up by a wild animal, which again, her trail would probably keep going, you know, if she was dragged off somewhere, unless, as some people have suggested, she was taken by a bird of prey, you know, that just flew down, picked her up, flew away. And I should say that that theory is so insanely implausible. You know, you would need a bird that is like 3 or 4 times the size of a normal bird in order to have the strength to carry off a small child like this. But yeah, either way, sadly, Yuki was never found. And this case still remains to this day one of Japan's saddest, most tragic unsolved mysteries. Guelph John Doe is a simple case, but this was just the unidentified body of a man found in 1970 in Ontario. He was a white man who had severe arthritis in his lower back. He had been dead for around 20 years by the time that he was found, and around the area he was found was some small little buttons, some white socks, some random bits of cloth. You know, technically clues, but not really. And as I said, he died likely sometime around the 1940s and 50s, and he has yet to be identified. Christopher Carlton Thompkins was a very tragic and very suspicious case where in 2002, this man, Christopher Carlton Thompkins, suddenly disappeared. And he was working at the time as part of a surveying crew, part of a 4-man team where they would go out, they would survey these areas, various lands, fields, paths, roads, etc. A fairly standard job. But on this day at around 8 a.m. as was usual, Christopher left the house and got in a ride with one of his co-workers to their site. They went to work as usual, all 4 of them working along in a line with each being roughly 50 feet apart, and they all worked throughout the morning. They then stopped for lunch at around 1:30, and according to the testimonies of one of these 4 men, they were just sitting down with Christopher, having lunch, and then they, turned around to talk to one of the other men, and when they turned back around just a few seconds later, Christopher was nowhere to be seen. Like, literally, he had just vanished from sight. They couldn't see him in the distance running away. He had left some of his food there and his belongings, and they said it was a bit strange. They kind of got up, they looked around a little while for him, and all they found was one of his work boots hung up over a fence, kind of implying that he ran away, he jumped over this fence, and then I guess got his boot stuck in the fence, and then didn't bother to retrieve it or get it down, and then I guess just ran away with one boot. It's all a bit weird. But also in their search, they found this blue material, like, cloth material, stuck in a barbed wire fence, which they suspected was part of his work uniform, and again kind of painted the picture of him running away, jumping over fences, maybe ripping his trousers on barbed wire. And investigators, did some preliminary searches. The investigation didn't really go anywhere, and the next piece of evidence found was around 5 months after this, when they found his other work boot around a mile away from where he was last seen. So it's a very suspicious case, for at least a few reasons, and it seems to me almost like designed or crafted, or like, a story being woven or something. Like, firstly, he just disappears, like just completely out of nowhere, like he's Batman or something. You just turn your head and he's just gone. Like, that realistically rarely happens in real life, especially when there are 3 other workers sitting there with you having lunch. And then these workers, or his colleagues, they take a while to search for him before calling his family or before calling the police. That's perhaps a little strange. And then maybe when police come, maybe we start an investigation into these other colleagues. Maybe they had something to do with his disappearance. Maybe they killed him. But then it's like, oh yeah, there's a convenient boot on top of a fence. Clearly he ran away, he left his boot there, so these 3 other guys are just off the hook. On top of all this, Christopher's family basically attested that Christopher was completely sane. He didn't have any random outbursts or delusions or psychosis or anything like that. Anything that would maybe suggest that he went a little bit crazy and ran away. And even if he did, even if he was so crazy to just up and leave, jump over a fence without any shoes on, like, surely someone else would have seen him. He would be found in the next town over, arguing with a guy in Walmart or something, or screaming at pigeons. Like, he wouldn't have just vanished completely into thin air. And if Christopher did want to run away, why would he do it in the middle of a workday, leaving behind his 2 shoes and all of his belongings and a bunch of his money, and never use his ID or social security number ever again? Like, surely you would just gather all your belongings, withdraw all of your money, call in sick for this particular day, and then go off and run away that way. Like, things just aren't adding up for this case. And so that brings up the very obvious question: if he didn't run away, then what exactly happened to him? Well, his co-workers were seemingly with him all morning, so if anyone knows, then it would seem to be them. And there was no one that could really attest to seeing Christopher, throughout most of the morning. And so is it possible that something happened between Christopher and between his colleagues sometime in the morning? Maybe they got into an argument, an altercation, and then either attacked Christopher on purpose or, shoved him or something. He fell backwards, hit his head, ended up just dying there on the spot. And then these guys just completely panicked and ended up getting rid of Christopher's body and taking his shoes, planting them on top of a fence, making it look like he basically ran away. Those seem to be the only two explanations, because you can't have a third explanation of a random guy came by, like a serial killer, and picked Christopher up because his colleagues attested to being there with him. They already said that he just he was there with them and he just vanished into thin air. So either that story is true or his colleagues had something to do with his disappearance. And I don't really want to turn this into a race thing because I feel like they're often just blown out of proportion. But these guys, Christopher's colleagues, were all white and Christopher was obviously black. And so perhaps it could have been, a discrimination thing, and maybe, as I said, they wouldn't kill Christopher over this, but maybe they were teasing him, bullying him a bit. He maybe, didn't want to take it anymore, stood up for himself, and then they either accidentally or on purpose ended up killing him. And this is just because there are a few comments from other people who work as surveyors, and they've said that, they are white, all of their surveyor friends are white, and it would be quite unusual to see a black person in this role. And so even them, as surveyors, have said that, yeah, there's probably a few, racist surveyors out there. So it might not have been completely out of the ordinary for something like this to occur, some, discrimination, bullying, which ended up in Christopher's death. And they did, realistically, if you wanted to do something like this, they did have a lot of time to spare. As I said, something might have occurred in the morning, maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. They only contacted, family and police at around 2, as they said they had had lunch at 1:30. Christopher then went missing. So if something happens at, say, 10 o'clock, by the time you contact anyone, it's, 4 hours. So that is more than enough time to get rid of Christopher, to plant the boot on top of the fence, and then to make up this story, make sure they're all in line. And yeah, so that is always a possibility. One of these co-workers was arrested and convicted several months after this case for a completely unrelated but nevertheless violent incident, showing that he was at least capable of being a bit aggressive, maybe of attacking someone. But sadly, this case and the search trailed off pretty quickly. There was no body found, no blood or attack evidence. And if Christopher had genuinely run away, he was 20 years old. It's not like he was a kid or anything. So I think that kind of lowered the priority of this search. And still to this day, no one has been prosecuted or charged with anything relating to his disappearance or to his murder. And Christopher Thompkins has still to this day never been found. What did Lillian Carney see? Or where did Lillian Carney go? Is a very interesting, almost kind of quirky disappearance that takes us all the way back to 1897, so a long time ago. And this was in, more or less the Canadian border, and more specifically, it was in Maine, the American side, not the Canadian side. But on this particular day, Mr. and Mrs. Carney were out picking blueberries, and they decided to bring along their daughter, little Lillian, and she was out there, just 6 years old, helping the two, walk around, search for bushes, pick blueberries, and just having a grand old time until Lillian went missing. And they looked around for her, they couldn't find her initially, so they then called for help. Other locals, citizens of the nearby town came out. There was hundreds of them that, helped with the search efforts, searched all around the fields and the forests, deep into the night, but there was ultimately no sign of Lillian. And as always, seemingly with these cases, there were, no further clues, no clothes left behind. And so the next morning, even more people came out to help, and they were just searching non-stop in the local area until at around 11 a.m. that morning, someone finally found Lillian really just a few miles from where she had initially gone missing. And boy, did Lillian have a tale to tell. She had on her some berries, just like casually in her hands, and she said, saving them as she wanted to eat them, but she didn't know whether they would make her sick or not. So she was saving them until she found her mum in order to ask her permission, which is just the cutest thing in the world. She also said that while she was gone, that the sun shone all the time, which is very strange. And then she said she didn't really know where she was or, where she had gone. But she said at one point she heard these voices, this kind of rustling movement, which may or may not have been the search team themselves, walking through the fields, talking about where she might be. But Lillian said that upon hearing them, she got a little bit scared and she hid and took cover because they might be tramps, which her words, not mine. She also said she encountered these strange little creatures about the size of her cat, but they weren't cats. And she said she went up to them, she clapped her hands, to scare them. And when she did this, they just scattered away. And that was it. Lillian was reunited with her family, but nobody really knows where Lillian went, where she might have been hiding, whether in some theories she was taken away, maybe zooped up into the sky, zipped around the galaxy for, 48 hours, or a bit of the older dimension traveling, time traveling, or some say that she was just a silly, light-hearted kid who went, on her own little mini adventure through the woods, hiding from tramps, clapping away rabbits, eating berries, except not eating them because they might be poisonous, and so saving them so she could show her mum the berries. But yeah, that was the case of Lillian Carney. The Morris murders were a very strange set of two murders which may or may not be connected. And as to why people might think they might be connected, well, it's very simple really. Take a look at these two women. They look pretty similar, kind of the same hair, same face, same skin color. And so if you squint your eyes a little bit, maybe they could be the same woman. Then what if I told you that these two women lived around the same area in Houston, Texas, even though they weren't related, but they were also both literally called Mary Morris. And so to distinguish between the two, we will call this lady Mary Lou and this lady Mary McGinnis. But as I said, they both looked fairly similar, both were called Mary Morris, both lived in the same town in Texas, and both were found within just 3 days of one another, dead in their respective cars. Mary Lou was found dead first, and she was found inside her car, which had been set on fire. And because it was burning for so long, they couldn't really determine how she had died, or the scene that led up to it, or retrieve any DNA evidence or forensics from it, fingerprints, hair samples, that sort of thing. And so that on its own was a very strange case. But then 3 days after this, Mary McGinnis was found dead also in her car, and this second case was even more suspicious. So we'll cover the first Mary in just a little bit, but as for this second Mary, Mary McGinnis, she was working as a nurse practitioner and was apparently reasonably well liked among, colleagues and friends. She was successful, she was good at her job, she got along with everyone, except one new co-worker, one male nurse that was recently hired, and he was somewhat of a massive creep. Mary's friend later told investigators that she told her, Mary told her friend that basically she was afraid of this person creeped her out, and when her friend asked her if she thought that he could hurt her, she replied, "Yes, I do, and I think that he could do worse." Mary would also have an incident one evening where she came back to her office, to pick up some documents or what have you, and found that a few things around her office, especially on her desk, had been moved. Photos kind of turned in odd directions, bits and bobs moved around where she knew that she hadn't left it like that, and a note that read, "Death to her," which is very suspicious. So Mary talked to her husband that day, Mike Morris, and she said, "Look, there's some crazy guy at work. I don't feel safe. Can you show me how to, use a gun? In fact, can I actually have your gun? Because I need it for my own safety." She apparently asked Mike to train her how to use the gun and to keep it, without telling anyone, to keep it beneath her driver's seat in case she was ever in danger and she needed to use it, which is very unnerving. Then, a few weeks later, Mary's friend recalled Mary just working away as normal before apparently encountering someone, they don't know who it was, but some strange person that spooked her in the pharmacy, and she was terrified. She just left the pharmacy immediately, and she said, "I don't feel safe. I'm just gonna run back to the hospital, turn off my computer, and then go home." And then, just 12 minutes after this, she made a phone call to 911 that has never been released to the public because apparently it is just too disturbing and chilling to listen to. The call is very likely by Mary, while she was in the middle of being attacked. And apparently it's just these horrible screams. Like, it really must be terrifying if they're not even willing to release it. And during this call, Mary wasn't able to give the operator her location or, many other details. And so she wasn't found until a little later on, dead in her car, having been shot in the head, and the murder weapon was her own gun, or at least her husband's gun, who he said that she had asked him to, leave in the car for her own safety. And on top of being shot, she was also incredibly violently beaten, so it was an insane attack for, at the time, unknown reasons. And there are just so many different angles and aspects to this case, so I'll try and go over them kind of bit by bit. And obviously during the early investigation, the police interviewed this, new male nurse that was working. They found out that he was a bit of a creep, that some of the other workers there thought he was a bit strange, and that Mary had complained about him to one of her friends. But outside of that, apparently they couldn't really find anything to link him to this murder, and so, at least for now, he does remain a minor suspect from the police, but he has not been convicted or charged for anything. And so in cases like this, who might be the next suspect? And if you answered the husband, as it is in most of these cases, you would be correct. They started investigating the husband, asking where he was on the day, how his relationship was with his wife, and why his handgun was at the scene of this brutal attack and murder, and why it was used to murder Mary. And it was then that he said, "Look, Mary came to me. She said there was a creep guy at work, and she asked me to put my gun into her car and to not tell anyone about it." And so that, Mike said, was how his gun got into the car. Then they asked about his marriage. They found out that Mary apparently had an extramarital affair, and she had roughly $700,000 in life insurance. So, there's some financial motivation right there. And with her apparently cheating on him, there is an emotional motive there. He also had the means with his own weapon being the murder weapon. And he didn't have the opportunity because he was busy and accounted for at the time of Mary's murder. But as happens a fair amount in these cases, he could have always gotten someone else to do his dirty work. And this theory was somewhat strengthened a little later on when they found the phone records for Mike, and they found that after Mary had already died, Mike had called her phone for 4 minutes. And they basically said to Mike, you know, who the hell were you talking to in these 4 minutes? It couldn't have been Mary because she was already dead. And he said that, you know, I wasn't talking to anyone. I just called Mary. She wasn't picking up. So I just left it ringing until it disconnected. And that was apparently 4 minutes, which I don't know about you, but no phone that I've rang, you know, no one's personal phone has ever rung for 4 minutes before disconnecting. It's normally about 20 seconds or something. And on top of this, Mary's phone wasn't found at the scene. So in my opinion, it seems somewhat likely that Mike had this killing arranged, and whoever killed Mary took her phone. Mike then called the phone and spoke with this killer for 4 minutes. You know, maybe they were trying to get their story straight. Maybe he was confirming the kill or something like that. But that is a very strange part of it. Another aspect is, as I said, the gun being put under the seat wasn't known to anyone besides Mike and apparently Mary. So either the gun was under there, Mary was in the car, she started to be attacked, so she pulled out the gun, the killer ended up wrestling it off her, and then before she could shoot him, he ended up turning the gun on her. Or the gun was never in the car, and Mike had taken it himself. He had given it to this killer, and the killer carried it to Mary, to the scene of the murder, and beat her before using the gun on her. Which it would be a bit of a stupid thing to use your own gun in a murder like this, but honestly, people have done a lot stupider things. But Mike basically just, you know, denies all of this, calls all of these theories crazy, denies all of the accusations, and so far at least, he has never been charged or prosecuted with anything related to Mary's death. And so this loops us back to the other Mary we covered, or that we mentioned, Mary Lou. And hypothetically, if you are Mike in this situation, you know, he finds out Mary is cheating, he kind of despises her, hates her, he wants to leave, but then maybe he gets a little greedy because she's got a, you know, $750,000 insurance policy. So he cooks up this plot to have Mary murdered, and he pays someone to do it. Now, whether this was the man at the hospital, you know, the male nurse, or whether it was just a random guy or someone that Mike knew, but either way, he gives this murderer, he gives them his wife's name, Mary Morris. He gives them a description of her, you know, brown, slightly poofy hair, a white woman in her 30s to 40s, living in Houston, Texas, and this killer ends up targeting the wrong Mary. I would be really interested in hearing your guys' opinions, because it is a bit of a strange case, a bit of a wild case. Is that theory about them being connected a little too far, maybe? Or is it too much of a coincidence to just ignore? Either way, neither of these cases were ever solved. Whoever killed these two ladies at the moment has completely gotten away with it, but whether they are connected or not is something that we don't really know. The lost city of the monkey god is a very cool entry, and this refers to a fairly large area deep in the Honduran jungle where very little of it has actually been fully explored. And rumors of this lost city, you know, the city of the monkey god, or the white city as it is often being called, have been around for absolutely ages. And it's strange because the Mayans, for example, you know, who were a civilization somewhat in the same area, you know, they weren't exactly in the same area, but in terms of like middle America sort of thing. But a lot of the Mayan stuff has been uncovered. You know, we know a fair amount about their culture, about their ruins and cities and temples, etc. But these other civilizations, the ones perhaps deep in the Honduran jungle, are just a complete mystery. And as far back as like the early 1900s, expeditions were at the time being undertaken to try and explore these various areas and to discover maybe new finds, new artifacts, new civilizations. And one somewhat important one was done in 1940 by an explorer named Theodore Maud, and this was his search for the White City. And he apparently found it. He went on this adventure, and when he returned with thousands of artifacts. And he said that he had found the city, and it was very secret, very hard to find, but he had managed to take back with him a bunch of artifacts. And according to the rumors and legends surrounding this city, most often by the local indigenous people, they said that within this city there was a huge, great, buried statue of this monkey god, hence, the name of the city. And so he came back with all of these artifacts, but he absolutely refused to tell anyone where the city was. He said, yes, while I was out there, while I was exploring, I did find the city. I took a bunch of artifacts, but he said that it was so secret and so beautiful that he really didn't want to tell anyone, because then there would just be a flood of explorers and looters, and they would just completely destroy the city. And so he ended up dying many years later, never having revealed what he discovered. The location of this lost city of the monkey god. And that was all the way back in the 1940s. But recently there have been more modern explorers, two of which being Steve Elkins and Bill Benison, who decided to launch their own search for this city. And so they went out into the Honduran jungle, they got this little airplane like this one here, and they attached onto it a laser scanner. And with it, they kind of flew over the area, and this laser scanner penetrated the jungle and kind of read and scanned the earth and ground below. And what they found was absolutely phenomenal. This laser was able to penetrate this thick forest and basically ignore all the vines and trees and branches and all that. And they saw scattered across this whole area these ancient structures, architecture, earth mounds, possible irrigation canals. And so this confirmed to them to basically be the remnants of an ancient city. And this city was very likely long before the arrival of Columbus, and it had been completely forgotten about and more or less buried deep within this Honduran jungle. And what they more or less concluded from this discovery was that this fable of the White City, or the City of the Monkey God, that this likely wasn't referring to a single city, but rather to an entire civilization that was, rumored to exist many moons ago, but that had been completely forgotten and fallen out of knowledge for both, us and perhaps for the local indigenous people. And what this civilization might have looked like, what some of their beliefs or traditions might have been, we basically have no idea, not unless someone does another deep dive into this jungle and starts to discover more things, starts to perhaps dig things up, and then links it all together like Charlie from Always Sunny. But either way, I just think stuff like this is absolutely fascinating. Shannon Night was the name of a man who was brought to a hospital in Chicago, Illinois in 2007. He had suffered from a traumatic brain injury, and he had no idea who he was, where he had come from, or what he was called. And so Shannon Night was obviously the name that he had made for himself, as no one around, including himself, knew his real name. He believes that he has a wife, that he has a son, but he has yet to find them. And he always carries around this red folder in which he has like little jottings, little journal writings that are apparently there to help maybe jog his memory. If he thinks of something, if he remembers something, he always writes it down, but still to this day, he has made no real headway in figuring out who he is, who he was, whether he has a family or not. And so yeah, that is Shannon Night. The Fanshang twin phenomenon is a strange phenomenon that occurred and maybe still is occurring in the small village of Fanshang in China. And what is this strange occurrence? Well, in this small village, there are only around 50 households. That's 50. And between them, they have produced 16 sets of twins. That's 16, which is roughly 12 times the national average, of twin rate. And the villagers, when they were, interviewed, when they had the press, come snooping around the town, asking questions about how this might be possible, they said that the water that they used in their well, there was one big well that used to supply the entire town, that this water was basically magical. It was cold in the summer, it was warm in the winter, and they said that by drinking this water, it basically was the cause of so many twins. But since around the 80s, a big part of this twin rate has gone down. There have only been 2 twins born in the last 20 or 30 years. But for the townfolk, this just further proves their theory, because they said nobody really uses the old well anymore. They get all of their water, piped in or whatever. And so the magic of this spring of water below the city, or below the village rather, is no longer being used. The Dahlsjo Disappearance, and this may or may not be the correct way to pronounce this. I have seen a few different pronunciations out there, so apologies, Swedish people, if I get this wrong. Please leave a phonetic pronunciation down in the description. But this was, on the surface, a very simple disappearance. But once you dig deeper, once you go down the rabbit hole of this one, it honestly just continues to go deeper and deeper and just get stranger and stranger. So I will try and cover it as simply as possible so all of our heads don't explode. But it involves mainly 3 men from Gothenburg, Sweden, who went missing in the 1960s. And these men were, and once again, I will butcher these names. Swedish names are not kind to me. But they were Jan Olof Dahlsjo, who was 21, Gay Roger Carlson, who was 22, and Kjell Åke Johansson, who was just 16. And all 3 were friends who commonly had jobs in like shipyards or as handymen, laborers, physical jobs sort of thing. And they were apparently, for whatever reasons, known to sometimes carry fairly large amounts of cash on them, which I guess was just from their paychecks, but could have been from something else. And they were somewhat familiar with law enforcement, meaning they were, a little rambunctious, like nothing extreme or bad. They weren't out, killing people or robbing people, but I think they were a little bit like, Harry Potter's gang, where they're not really bad people. They just like breaking laws, messing around, just a whatever attitude, disregard for the law. And so I'm pretty sure they were that sort of person. But anyway, that's more or less the background for these guys. And on this day, the 29th of July 1965, Jan had already told his mum that he was going off to go camping somewhere, and come the morning of the 29th, very early in the morning, like 2 a.m., the boys visited a friend of theirs to basically say like, cheerio, we'll be back in a short while, we're just gonna head off somewhere. And because work ethic was just incredible in those days, Carlson still, after meeting someone at 2 a.m. that morning, he still went to the employment office at 6:30 the next morning and accepted a quick, job, and worked that job until noon of that day. Kjell, the 16-year-old, he left his home that morning, and in the afternoon, all 3 of the men met up at this little place called Café Marden, which was the last time these men would ever be seen again. And they were seen at around 3 o'clock that afternoon, getting into a dark blue Volvo PV444, which that just rolls off the tongue, that name. But they were seen getting into this car, which belonged to Jan's brother and was being driven by Carlson, even though none of the men actually had a driver's license. Although this was the 60s, the decade of hippies and love and peace, and apparently a complete disregard for driving laws. But that was the first part of the case. The men met up at this calf, they drove off somewhere north, and both them and this car were never found and never seen again. All three of the men had girlfriends, which I'm sure they would, want to return home to. And Shell, the 16-year-old, actually became a father just recently. So I think it's very unlikely that the men, went on a road trip and then left the country and were like, yeah, we're just gonna leave home. It seems very likely that something significant happened. So yeah, that was part 2 of this strange, collection of cases. Or rather, sorry, that was part 1. Part 2 involves another missing individual who went missing also on that day, also in Gothenburg, and that was an 18-year-old art student named Hubner Him Lundqvist. These names are just killing me, honestly. But this was an 18-year-old art student who was originally from Stockholm, and he was at the time traveling up through Gothenburg to live with a group of artists that lived up even further north in Lyskill. And he apparently got the train to Gothenburg and then either got the train further north or ended up hitchhiking. But regardless of the transportation method he chose, he was also, after that day, never seen again. And that is part 2 of the mystery. Now, as for part 3, it is, I will warn you, a little insane, but this also took place on the same day, also in Gothenburg, and it was an occurrence known only as the Frogman heist. And as you might know, I absolutely love heists, but I think this was more of a bank robbery than a heist, so it's a little disappointing. But basically you had 2 men, one dressed up as a woman, and they went into this bank in Gothenburg at around 2 p.m. that day, and once they got into the bank, they revealed that they had these submachine guns, and they basically started firing into the ceiling, demanding money. And then one of the bank tellers in the bank just so happened to be a wrestler. Like, I know it sounds like I'm telling a dream or something. Like, yeah, we went into the bank, but then also one of the men was a woman, but then they weren't actually a woman, they were just dressed as a woman. And then they went to rob the money, but then one of the bank tellers was actually a wrestler, and then he attacked one of these men, and I promise you it does get even crazier. But this wrestler slash bank teller, went up to one of these men, ended up wrestling them to the ground, and in this struggle, one of the robbers ended up shooting himself in the leg. But eventually he was able to break free. The men made away with roughly like $20,000 to $40,000 in today's money, and they obviously stole kronas, not dollars. But this was in Sweden, and it was also more than like 60 years ago, so I had to do some very rough calculations on this. But yeah, roughly $20,000 to $40,000, and they took the money, they left the bank, they ran from the bank down to the nearby river, and they started stripping all of their clothes off, and beneath their clothes they were found to be wearing scuba gear. So they then jumped with this scuba gear into the river, and they tried swimming away, but some of the bank employees had chased them to the river, and they were throwing rocks at these men while the men were, bopping up out of the water, firing their machine guns at them. And yeah, what the hell is even this case? But eventually one of the robbers did manage to, swim down the river and get away, while the other, the one who was shot in the leg, decided, he was bleeding pretty badly. He couldn't really swim, so he just stayed in his scuba gear down beneath the water, and he was eventually apprehended, as well as a third accomplice. So yeah, absolutely insane case. But all of these 3 cases, as I said, happened on the same day, in the same city, and they may or may not be connected. And so for this one, I think there are a great many theories. Some absolutely insane, some completely reasonable, some kind of in between the two. And one theory was that this 18-year-old artist took a train up to Gothenburg, then ended up hitchhiking further north and was picked up by these 3 other men. They gave him a ride to wherever he was going, but then while he was in the car, the group, ended up veering off the side of a mountain or into a river or lake or something, completely submerging all 4 men and this car. That is one theory. Or, they were taken away by aliens, or because, you know, some of these men had a fair amount of cash on them sometimes. It was theorized that they could have been involved in, you know, dealing substances and various forms of smuggling, although there really wasn't much evidence for this. But it was thought that if they were into this, then the scuba frogman bank heists that happened in the city, that might have caused, you know, more police attention. Maybe there was wee-woo all around the town, and this kind of spooked the men, and they drove off more frantically. They didn't want to get caught. Maybe they thought the police were there for them, and this then led to them, you know, panicking, driving off a cliff somewhere. Or maybe they went up north to do a deal with someone. The deal ended up going wrong, so these other men ended up shooting our 3 missing people and perhaps disposing of their bodies, completely destroying the car somehow. Or all of those same theories, but without the 18-year-old artist, him, as there were also some theories that he kind of went to live alone. You know, maybe he traveled to France or to America making just a living. And I think one person running away and never, you know, contacting anyone is definitely more likely than 3 people who all have girlfriends, one of them as a kid. So I think him running away and disappearing is not completely out of the question. And so basically, that's the case, or kind of multiple cases all in one, but it is still, to this day, the largest, longest running disappearance case in Swedish history. And there were some other minor details about the case which I didn't mention, as personally I don't think they're that important to the case, but there was a letter sent by the artist kid, him. You know, he wrote this to his parents, and it basically reads, "Here I am now. I took the 8 a.m. train to Gothenburg, hoping to hitch a ride now. Do not worry. Kisses, him." So a pretty standard letter, I would say, or postcard. And there may have been some sort of vague possible sightings of him, you know, of him. It's a little confusing calling him, god damn it. But there were some vague sightings of him from like Singapore to Australia, which led to the theories about him traveling abroad or living on a cruise ship or something. And there was also a little tidbit about when Carlton went missing. And before I cover this, in the original case, all 3 of these men did go missing on the same day, but they were all reported missing at different times. And so it was actually a while before the, you know, police were able to link the 3 and say, okay, they were all going somewhere together on the same day. They all went missing on the same day. It's all one connected case. But originally, when Carlton went missing, his sister went to look for him, and she ended up going to his apartment. And when she knocked on the door, another man, someone that she didn't know or recognize, opened the door, and he was apparently wearing the sweater that Carlton's sister had knitted for him. You know, it's like this strange random man who was acting a little bit, you know, a little bit dodgy, wearing the sweater that you made for your brother. And she thought this was a little bit strange, but thought, you know, it's probably one of his friends or something. Maybe someone Carlton knew. And Carlton said, you know, oh, I'm going to be out of town for like a week or something. You can just crash at my place if you want. And so I think this most likely is what it is. But people have suggested that this unidentified man could have had something to do with Carlton's disappearance. There is also this footage that was taken of Gothenburg from around this time. And some people say some of the cars that were, you know, filmed may or may not have been this blue car that they were driving, but the jury is still out on that one. But despite all of these, you know, outside of the bank robbery, despite these 2 missing persons cases being open for like 60 years, we are still no closer to finding any of the original 3 men or of the car that they were in, and so still to this day these cases remain unsolved and these men remain unfound. The crew of Casie Nicole refers to this boat, the Casie Nicole, on which 4 people, Billy Joe Neesmith, his brother Nathan Neesmith, their nephew Keith Wilkes, and their friend Franklin Brantley, all set out on this boat for a 7-day fishing trip, and for the most part were never seen again. Now, this happened in early April 1990, and the 4 men set off from the McIntosh County Pier in Georgia, and honestly, just everything seemed to go wrong. The boat had recently had some mechanical work done on it, which sounds good, but also means that there was some, mechanical problems. And on just the second day of this trip, Nathan started to notice, multiple mechanical problems. There was water leaking into the boat, and the bilge pumps stopped working, which were the pumps that were needed to pump the water out of the boat. So that's not good. And then the boat lost all of its power, the radio stopped working, and so as a group decision, the group decided to basically abandon the ship and to go off into this little life raft. Except the raft itself was also leaking water, and it was in a bit of a state. So now, do you see what I mean about everything that can possibly go wrong going wrong? I think also a large part of it was down to the men not preparing enough. If you go out onto a rickety old boat that has mechanical problems and is leaking water, and the life raft you have with you is also a piece of crap, it just seems like poor planning to me. But then when they were on this life raft, against the decision of the group, Nathan decided to swim from where they were, roughly 2 to 3 hours in the middle of the ocean, back to their boat, which, they had abandoned. And he must have been a fantastic swimmer, because honestly, how do you even find a boat 2 or 3 hours distance away in the middle of the ocean? It just seems like an insane task. But he eventually did find the boat. It was still floating there, kind of half sunken in the water, and he clung to this boat and stayed there on his own, surviving apparently in the middle of the water for multiple days. And while he was floating there, he saw off in the distance this freighter kind of sailing around, which apparently didn't notice Nathan, otherwise, probably would have rescued him. But he said this freighter was sailing around. It seemed to kind of stop in the general direction that his crew was in, or that he had last seen his crew in this life raft. And so he assumed that this freighter had rescued them and they were all safe, all alive, and eventually by April 15th, Nathan himself was rescued, with him being found floating inside of a styrofoam box that he had acquired from the boat, and he was almost dead at this point, 20 miles off the Georgian coast, and by this point had been alone in the waters for over 4 days. When he asked about his brother and his relative and his friend, he was told that nobody had seen them, nobody had rescued them, they didn't know where they were, and they were at this point presumed dead. Despite extensive searches for the men, there was never any sign of them or their raft, which is not too mysterious, I don't think. You have 3 men stranded in the middle of the ocean on a rickety old raft that's leaking water. It's not too much of a stretch, I don't think, to say that they likely just sunk, ended up drowning. But what is very strange is that months after this incident, Nathan and Billy's sister, Onida, and the owner of the boat, Doug Tyson, started to receive these strange, almost cryptic phone calls from a Spanish-speaking man who said that the men that were on this raft, that they were actually rescued and were being kept alive somewhere abroad, and he suggested that he would be bringing them home soon. But after a few of these calls, they suddenly just stopped. The man never called again. He was never heard from again, nor were any of the men that he had apparently, had in his company, apparently rescued and was bringing back here. No sign or mention of them was ever seen again. So I think the first part of this case isn't really a mystery. Some men go out on a boat in the middle of the ocean, in a rickety old boat that's sinking, it's letting in water, and it sinks, most of the men die, so that's quite well understood. But since the raft was never found, the bodies of the men were never found, it does lead a little bit of credence, at least, to this strange phone call saying that yes, we rescued these men, we kept them, we know where they are, we're gonna bring them home soon, and then just, hearing nothing about that. That is, to me, a little bit strange. Holly Bobo's bucket. So Holly Bobo was a 20-year-old nursing student who initially went missing in 2011 in Darden, Tennessee. And she was at home on this day. She had gotten up, she was getting ready to go to nursing school at 4:30 in the morning, so very early. And at around 7:30, she made a call to her boyfriend, Drew Scott, who was at the time hunting turkey on his grandmother's property. Then, shortly after, some neighbors heard a scream from the Bobo property, and they ended up calling Holly's mother. She, at the time, was at work, so she called Holly's brother, Clint, who was in the house at the time, and he had only recently woken up due to some loud barking by the family dogs. Clint said that he saw Holly outside with a man dressed fully in camouflage, completely from head to toe, and he said that it looked like Holly was kneeling down next to her boyfriend Drew, and they were talking back and forth. He said she was crying and she was saying, no, you can't do this. And the brother at the time assumed that Drew was basically breaking up with her. And this is when Holly's mum called Clint. Clint told her all about this. He said Holly was kneeling down in the garage. She was talking with Drew, and his mum then said, Clint, that is not Drew. Go and get a gun and shoot him. Then the mum called the police, but there was a slight delay due to some mix-up. And when Clint checked outside again, he saw that Holly was no longer kneeling down, but that she was walking with this strange camouflaged man off into the woods. So Clint grabbed a loaded pistol. He went to follow them out into the woods, but after going out a short distance, he couldn't see where they had gone. He couldn't see any trace of them, but he did find bloodstains of Holly's in the garage, and soon enough, the police were called and an investigation and search were started. And they initially started a preliminary search. They looked off into the woods, they kind of cordoned off some areas, but this initial search didn't find Holly or the man, and so they kind of moved their investigation along. And later on, her phone records were tracked, her triangulation, and they saw that her phone basically went from the family home. It went up through the woods, they tracked it north before stopping for a short while in the woods, and then continuing back down south in a different direction. And eventually, they found this phone traced all the way down, and it ended at a certain point, and precisely where it ended, they found her phone there on the side of the road with its SIM card removed and the phone just smashed. But years later, in 2014, some men were out and about searching for ginseng roots when they stumbled across this strange bucket in the woods, and under this bucket were the partial remains of Holly Bobo. This spot was around the area initially tracked by her phone, and she had seemingly been led somewhere, shot to death in the head, and then left or buried out in these woods. And police weren't entirely sure when the remains were found, whether she had been killed somewhere else and then her remains left here for some reason, or whether she had been buried somewhere and then wild animals had taken partial remains of her, scattered them around. But it was in the middle of the woods, underneath this bucket, so it kind of explained why she hadn't been found in all this time. And when I was looking into this case, there were some men who were actually charged for her murder, but their involvement in it, if I'm honest, is a little bit iffy. So first they arrested this guy called Dylan Adams, and this was on a completely unrelated gun charge. And then apparently he confessed around that time that he had gone to his brother's house, Zach's, and saw him there with some of his friends, and more importantly with Holly. And Zach had apparently admitted to his brother of kidnapping, assaulting, and videotaping this girl before obviously killing her. Dylan later recanted this confession and said that it was kind of forced out of him by the investigators. But by this point, the police had already brought Zach in and also arrested Dylan and some of Zach's friends. And it was kind of a strange case. They went through the trial, they went through the prosecution, and although a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, still these men were charged with, various sentences. One was given like 35 years, one was given life plus 50 years for aggravated assault, kidnapping, first-degree murder. But there was, on top of all of this, another man who was originally a suspect in the case, and that was a man named Terry Britt, who was a local convicted sex offender, convicted of multiple rapes over the years, and apparently his voice matched up to the one that Clint, Holly's brother, heard that morning. And on top of that, at the time of this murder, Terry had longer hair, partially matching the description of the camouflaged man, and after the murder took place, Terry then, for some reason unexplained, ended up cutting his hair shorter. And so he was an early suspect in the case, but he was kind of glossed over when these other men, came forward, when they were the focus of the investigation. They just kind of brushed Terry aside. And it was weird, even his alibi for that morning was also found out to be a lie, because he said he was at home with his wife fixing a bathtub, and initially his wife said, yeah, I was home, but she was later found to have actually gone to work that morning, and the store which Terry bought the bathtub from didn't have any records of selling a bathtub to Terry. The only evidence for this was a hand-signed receipt that Terry himself had. So yeah, it's a bit of a strange case. It's absolutely heartbreaking, imagining what happened to Holly. She was training, studying to be a nurse, one of the best, most selfless professions there are, and she was seemingly attacked by perhaps someone she didn't even know in her own home, wounded in the garage, forced out of the house, and then eventually was killed. It is an incredibly sad case, and I can't make up my mind about whether these men are actually guilty or not, or whether it was in fact Terry or someone else entirely. But if you have any theories on it, if you have any opinion on the case, please do let me know down below, as I do, in fact, read all of the comments you guys leave. Jason Derek Brown is a man who used to be on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, but now is simply a wanted phantom. And he was wanted for shooting an armored car guard and for stealing the money that he was carrying, which amounted at the time to over $56,000. And this was back in 2004. And a little before this, he purchased a gun, because he wasn't really a convicted criminal at the time, but he was thought to do fraud crimes. He ran 2 little businesses from his home. He at one point used fake ID to purchase a car from a sales place. And so it seemed like he had this lavish lifestyle that he just needed to fund, and he didn't mind breaking the law or hurting anyone in order to fund it. So as I said, he purchased a firearm and he went on a firearms course, and I kid you not, the name of the place was Totally Awesome Guns and Range. Amazing name. But he then, on the morning of November 29th, ran up in a little hoodie to this guard, 24-year-old Robert Keith Palomares, and shot him 5 times in the head before taking the cash, running off into a nearby alleyway, and escaping on a bicycle. Robert, sadly, was pronounced dead as soon as he arrived at hospital, and soon a nationwide hunt for Jason was started. And they tracked him kind of, vaguely from place to place, city to city, state to another state, and he was seemingly just out of reach always. He didn't stay around in one place for too long, but he didn't officially know that the FBI wanted him as a suspect, or that they were at the time actually hunting him, until some of the top guys at the Phoenix Police Department felt that because this was such a big case, it was such a high profile case, that they needed to be seen actually doing something. So they decided to have a press announcement where they would basically explain the case, explain the work they had been doing, so people didn't accuse them of just sitting around doing nothing. And in this press conference, they said that they had taken the escape vehicle, this bicycle, and they had actually managed to gather these fingerprints from it. And so they named Jason Derek Brown as their main suspect. And honestly, what sort of amateur 2-bit criminal doesn't wear gloves when doing something like this? It's just unbelievable. But after making this announcement, the FBI had a search warrant at the time for somewhere that they highly suspected Jason of being. But because he must have seen this press announcement, he knew the FBI were kind of onto him. He escaped less than 1 hour before the FBI turned up to arrest him. So he was on the run once again. He traveled to a few other states, also to around the border, down near Mexico. And then after this, according to the FBI, he basically just became a phantom and dropped off the face of the earth. He hasn't been seen since, although there have been multiple sightings of him, but these are either all unconfirmed or actively debunked, with actually Sean Penn's body double being stopped under the suspicion of being Jason, which is an interesting little tidbit of the case. But where Jason Derek Brown is to this day, over 20 years later, we have no real idea. And that is all we have time for. Now, unless they add even more entries to this iceberg, this should be the last video in the 8th tier. As always, the entire tier will be, smushed together and then uploaded as one giant video. It just makes viewing a little bit easier, I think. And if you haven't already, check out the Connor's Curiosities merch. Very cool stuff on there. And remember to subscribe and like the video so you are notified when we put out the new icebergs and perhaps 1 or 2 separate individual cases coming very soon. I hope you are having a lovely day wherever in the world you are, or actually afternoon or night or whatever time it is there. And as always, thanks for watching. Come on, everybody, and give a little clap. Come on, everybody, and give a little clap. This channel may have driven me insane.